the climate has changed. I could see I could get easy connectivity, not like yesterday, where because of rain there was problem. So that shows how the changes in the weather also can have profound changes in our own thoughts. And that is where I think, with the on the request of Professor Pradipatra, who is taking great interest in organizing the program, he had asked me to think about and to talk about rethinking or let's say rewriting history. I mean, you talk of rethinking, but rethinking is also a kind of a form of rewriting, and which precedes what, that has to be yet discussed. I mean, whether rethinking comes first or rewriting comes first. Sometimes as teachers, we write first and then we think, which is not a probably correct thing to do, but we need to first rethink, then only we have to rewrite. So, since the theme of the workshop has been on ethnicity, on gender, on history, and we know in our own country, since 1994, after the Bharatiya Janata Party and its allies were able to form government, and in 2014, when they have been able to have quite a huge majority in forming the government, we know that in our own country there has been a kind of a call, which is almost assumed the form of a slogan, that we must have to start rewriting history rather than merely think about rather than merely go about as the history has been presented to us. And when we go through this kind of what I call it polemics, whether you need to change or you don't change. So, and they seem to be almost polemic in their own approach, in their own thought. And our mind is awakened to what you call it, rejudge our own history that has been presented to us right from the ancient times, and also makes us sit up and think as to whether there is really a need to rethink and rewrite history, and at all it is appropriate for a growing nation like India, and India, to be able to cope up with the past. I think I still remember the discussion that was here by the other presenters on other resource persons on memory, whether the memories that are being hit onto our mind or that are being inbuilt into our mind by way of constant bombarding of kind of particular line of thought, and whether we'll be able to, and we need to overcome those very, very bitter memories, and need to feel happy in our own pursuit of scholarship, of writing the facts as they are present in our own society, which may or may not have got written. So I think when you talk of rewriting history or rethinking, we'll talk of the differences in the end. But when you talk of rethinking history, I think the basic postulations which are there in that particular terms of rethinking history, we need to understand that there is a demand for reorganizing facts, and also to reorganize and probably to do away with the fictions which may be part of the history, and also to sort of destroy or to work for the destruction of the lies which tend to be embedded in the history. I think whenever we talk of rethinking history, we need to understand that by talking of rethinking of history, there is a tremendous responsibility which is being cast on us as scholars to challenge the accepted notions as they have been propagated in the way of interpreting history of our own country and of any society at any particular point of time. So that there is a kind of a challenge which is embedded into the very concepts of rethinking history, and that is what I think Professor Pradipatra must be totally devoted to the idea that probably people need to be more challenging in their own research orientation. People need to be more challenging in their own assumptions, and people also need to feel more challenging, to cast a new path for themselves, as researchers, and to probably reach a new point in the context of explanations of our own history, and also which includes our own present day society. I think, and then whenever we talk of rethinking history, in addition to the challenges that are there in the context of reinterpreting history, we need to also understand there is also a need to rethink the traditional paradigms which tend to be present in the context of the past history, which is found in our own history books and also in our own oral history. So, and in the context of the rethinking history, we also need to understand that there is a need, whenever we talk of rethinking history, the very particular term, the particular word, the particular passion that is embedded in this particular concept of rethinking history. There is also a kind of an inherent felt need to experiment with new ways of presenting and interpreting history. So there, that these kind of, we know that there are a lot of embedded thoughts in the rethinking history, which tends to be comprising of these characteristics that I just talked about. I think whenever we talk of history, popularly we all assume that everybody has a history, everything in the society has a history, and nothing exists behind history, nothing exists without history. So whether we pick up any concept, we pick up any particular term, we pick up any particular idea, we pick up any particular movement, or we pick up any kind of an individual or collective action which are present in the societies at different point of time, we find that everything tends to have a history. And when everything seems to be having a story behind it, I think when you talk of history, I think when there was no gender history, there was no emergence of gender history, people thought history means his story. That means the story of the men as they have been written about, their victories, their operations vis-a-vis the other societies, or as you said, their contributions towards building up their own community in terms of power, in terms of wealth, in terms of various other production of knowledge. But as the feminism arose, as the awareness about the gender contribution or about the women's contribution also emerged, that his story become probably his and her story. But because it seems to be known as history, it tends to combine both the men and the women's contribution, both positively and negatively towards one's own society and also towards the global society as such. So it is. So when we talk of history, and we need to understand that it's also important to recognize and remember that the kind of histories that we assign to thoughts or to assign to things and people are nothing but self-composed, but composed, created, constituted, constructed, and always situated meaning. In other words, whatever we see in the history, we know that while everything has a history, everybody has a history, both men and women tend to be very, very great actors in history, as we could see. Otherwise, without their contribution, probably the civilization could not have grown up to such a stage which we call it now, 21st century civilization. And here we find that whatever that we in this kind of history that we are talking about, we need to understand that the history tends to contain ideas of ideas that we assign to various things and place, which are known as phenomena or and these ideas that we tend to superimpose on this phenomena tend to be rather composed, created, constituted, constructed, and also what we know is situated context, or as they have been located in the context of our own growth of civilization. So when you talk of history, then we understand that history is nothing but must be carrying somebody's imagination, somebody's kind of as you talk of you have in English they talk of some kind of artifice which tends to be self-created. So here it's almost like a created, composed, constructed, constituted, and also situated as per the imagination of the writers of history, or as to talk of history in the context of the historiography. And whenever we talk of this, besides this, we need to also remember that they tend to also carry, as I told you a little while ago, they tend to carry basically with them the author's philosophy or author's take on the world both in the past, present, and future. So these ideas are never free from any kind of an individual, you can call it motive. I'm not saying of in a negative term, but when you talk of motive, it's like the individual's own self-wish, if you like to say, or it could be also individual self-created world. I think whenever we talk of English writings, we know that whether you call it poetry or a novel or a fiction or a non-fiction, as we call, they tend to be almost self-created, bordering on, I'm not saying self-delusion, but bordering on something like self-glorification. As we think, we write. And that is what we also find in history. And there is no point that we can attribute any kind of scientific element to the writing of history or to the presentation of history of any one particular community to the same community or to other communities at large. So here, not only they tend to carry the author's self-philosophy or the author's take on the world, author's ideas on the world of the past, of the present, of the future, and history nonetheless tends to remain a form of a knowledge history. Plainly, we can call it a narrative representation. So history tends to be almost a narration of the happenings as they happen at a particular point of time, and it tends to merely give us a kind of a narration without telling us without making any kind of a value proposition, whether a particular happening at a particular point of time in history was at all good or bad, or it was, as we call it, or it was ugly. So here we find that if we quote an American philosopher of history, Hayden White, I quote him: "We can know the truth of the past through a detailed knowledge of what happened, the facts of the matter." He says that we can history is important simply because we can know the truth of the past through a detailed knowledge of what happened, the facts of the matter. And though the history seems to be following some kind of an empirical method, some kind of empirical method at some point of time, we discover our subject knowledge to possess objective knowledge in our own history. In other words, he says that through the adoption of as we call it, empirical method, we know in history writing, empirical method cannot be solely practiced as a method simply because that the happenings that happened in the long past cannot be anymore empirically verified. That is how we find history is not a discipline of science. But nonetheless, empirical method is followed in the context of the writing of the present history. Through the empirical method, we are able to discover our subject knowledge, the knowledge that we want to gain on a particular subject that we have chosen for our own study, and by following empirical method, we tend to acquire objective knowledge in our own history. But the crucial point still remains in the context of the rethinking of history or rewriting of history tends to be about knowledge. That if at all people want to go on the mission of rewriting the history, or even one before rewriting, one goes on to rethink about the historical phenomena that have happened in the context of any particular community or communities, or in a particular country. The sole objective tends to be rather very purely about knowledge production, or about knowledge knowledge acquisition, which is a new process where we tend to look forward to find out as to what and how it is how it is possible to know the past as it happened in the past. So history, instead of being while it is a narration of the happenings, or it's a plain and simple, as you call it, a narrative representation, we need to also understand that history is first and foremost also a kind of a literary work, or if you like, literary narration. It tends to be a kind of a collection of words which may have ideas embedded in the deployment of those words, to justify or to negate the ideas which tend to come to the mind of the author, who tends to be engaged in the writing of history, or even in the context of the rethinking history. So history, while it's simply a narration, narrative representation, it also tends to be a literary work, and the literary work tends to be concentrated on the past. It is also a literary composition of the date into a narrative where historian tends to be devoted towards creation of a meaning with uses of his words in the context of the history writing. So here we find this literary work simply because there is a meaning which can be also found out in the deployment of the words, as is being seen in the context of the writing, any writing exercise. So here I think we need to remember that, as we have talked about so far, history is a narrative work. History is also a form of literature, or it's a literary narration. And we also know history tends to also have more or less the character of a literature, and where we find that in the historical work, the epistemological and the philosophical assumptions that the author or the historian tends to have assumed for himself tend to be solely belonging to the historian rather than to any other person, including the reader. So here, when we talk about the history as being as we talked about, solely the self-creation of the historian or the writer of history, we need to think about as to whether we need to question these philosophical assumptions which have been assumed maybe quite logically by the author, or maybe without any sense of logic. So it gives rise to the question of whether we need to question these philosophical assumptions, and simply because history can correspond with the reality of the past through a knowledge of its content. Because history tends to correspond with the reality of the past with the through the knowledge of its content. There is a question tends to arise as to we must need to question the philosophical assumptions which may have been assumed by the writer of history or by the historian. So that is where I think that takes us to the point as to why in the context of scientificism, we know we are in the age of post-truth, but nonetheless the positivism was based on more on scientificism, scientific ideas, and that is where in science we know we are told that we must question everything rather than merely accept things as they are presented to us in any form, including in the form of history. So here we find that when you look at epistemologically, I think when you talk about history, it tends to have epistemological and philosophical assumptions by the historian, by the history writer. We need to also understand that history epistemologically is a form of literature which tends to carry our philosophies of life and not an empirical method. The historian like Jenkins tends to have said that history is an epistemological, is a form of literature epistemologically, and also it tends to carry our own philosophical assumptions, our own philosophies of life, self-philosophy of life, and also our own lived life experiences that human beings tend to feel and live within a particular society. And it is certainly not an empirical method. It is certainly not a verifiable method. So here we find that if we take into account the ideas which were very, very dominant in the colonial times, led by Foucault, led by Macaulay, and later on by Michael Foucault, we can understand that history is not the same as the past. I think somewhere we talked of deconstruction yesterday. If we talk of deconstructionism tend to look at things in relation to its opposite, and tends to question every assumption that seems to have been assumed in the earlier period preceding the era of deconstructionism. So here we find, so if we go by the ideas of Michael Foucault and primarily the ideas of deconstructionism, we need to understand that history cannot be treated as the same as the past. Although there is and we all know there's always a difference between history and the past. What may have been recorded may not be the same as may be present in the past. So, but nonetheless, since and whatever is recorded of the past tends to be known as history. So that is how Jenkins tends to say history is not the same as for everyone. History is different to different people simply because it tends to have philosophical assumptions of one's own philosophies of life. And also we should remember that that history also has a purpose. That is how we find as the deconstruction, the postmodernist ideas of deconstruction tends to emphasize on the fact that history cannot be the same for everyone. History cannot be treated as almost the recording of the past in the true sense of the term, and also history tends to be about a purpose. And we know when we write history, that is where the question of bias comes in, which we call it the philosophical assumptions of the author. And history tends to have a purpose. And history also, as we see in the past, history tends to be about power. Power as to who exercised power when, on what, and to what effect that power was used, and so as to understand the consequences that the exercise of power by the so-called actors of history tend to leave behind in our own annals of history for the various communities. We also have to, if you go by the ideas of deconstructionists, we need to understand that history is also never innocent, because we all know we write, that's how we said history has a purpose. Since it has a purpose, we also need to understand that history is never innocent. History always written with an intention of good or bad, depending on the author's own self-perception, and it tends to be hence not always logical. But we should also remember that history although it cannot be logical, it will, however, be ideological, and not in terms of political bias, but in terms of moral rights and wrong. So, these are the deconstruction to point out to our own attention that history cannot be treated as an innocent discipline or innocent writing of the events. Rather than it should be understood in the full context of the term in the days of deconstruction, or in the days of postmodernism, or even in the days of post-truth. I think somewhere we need to also, hence our attention is drawn to the fact that we need to think and rethink which we may be calling historical facts or history. So that is why. So that tends to give us enormous responsibility to question everything that is being presented to us, simply because the deconstructionists, by questioning everything, tend to have given us a kind of a whole litany of ideas which tend to be very, very, if I'm allowed to use the word, very, very dangerous when we use and weigh particular term that has been used by the so-called deconstructionists. And here we find, so we need to understand to simply that history is only a description of things that happen, and hence it can be easily questioned. It can be easily rethought about. It can easily be rewrote. If at all, it does not tend to present a correct picture of the past, which is of great significance to the communities who may be residing within a particular geographical area or within a particular territory. And here we find that history, although it's a description of things that happen, and it tends to have no intrinsic meaning as the facts or the happenings are being presented in the books of our own history, or even in the description of the history of any particular community of a particular country. So here, when you find that it is not logical, it is ideological, we also need to remember that the logic of history is not one of discovery, but of construction. As we said, history is a construction, history is constituted, history is created, history is more and more self-created kind of idea. So here we need to understand that history is simply a creation, and history's responsibility is not about discovery of the facts as they may, or discovery of the facts here is the happenings. I'm not going to the logical dimension of the facts, logical aspect of fact, but as the happenings as they may have happened in the past. So history, the logic of history is of construction, and that's how we talk of, when you talk of deconstruction, we tend to destroy the early held assumptions and tend to give new meaning to the happenings as they may have happened in the past, and tend to be also in the nature of reconstruction. So that's how history, thinking history or rewriting history is in the nature of reconstruction rather than merely continuation of the constructed idea which may be presented in the context of the philosophical assumptions held by the history writer, which is the art of historiography. And here also we find that the logic of history tends to be also dependent on referentiality. It tends to refer to the happenings as they have happened in the past, and tend to be not devoid of any kind of reference. In addition to referentiality, we need to also understand that the logic of history tends in the history writing. We need to also we tend to deploy figurative thinking. By presenting certain arguments, and by not presenting certain arguments, and also by our own use of theory, concept, and also above all that of ethics. I think so. Here, when you talk about all this, we can find that no matter how much we differ or agree with the ideas of history being an ideological phenomenon rather than a political history writing, we need to agree that history nonetheless happens to be a task which is primarily achieved in the context of our own desire for knowledge production. So history tends to be a kind of a very, very inevitable process of knowledge production that we tend to associate it with our own stages of learning or with our desire of learning. So, so when you talk of, if we have to question what is history, if we have to question what is the epistemological status of historical knowledge as they have to happen to be present in any particular society at any point of time, and why history should be taught, since we have been taught history right from our school days up to today, these questions tend to be asked in the context of the long-held belief that history is nothing, although it's a literary narration, it's a narrated description, or as you call it, it's like a narrated work. It's still, history tends to be almost a speculative experiment. So we need to understand that if at all, whatever we are presented in terms of history, it tends to be a speculative exercise. It tends to be driven by the motivation of the human beings, by the history, by the writer of history, and which also may be dominant in that particular time, at that particular time, in that particular society, and in the given situation. So here we find since we have we live in the era of post-structuralism, post-modernism, post-feminism. I think we talked of feminism, but we also know that feminism has gone much beyond in the more than 50 years. That now we are certain changes have come up in feminism where it tends to be known as now post-feminism. So in the era of post-structuralism, in the era of post-Marxism, in the era of post-feminism, in the era of post-colonialism. If we talk about, we know that there and also the various deconstruction approaches that are being presented to us, we are now asked to think very, very significantly as to what passes for history is to be regarded as something imagined rather than something which is very, very factual or which is very, very scientific, since the empirical knowledge is cannot be used to verify the truth of any kind of a reporting about a historical event of the past. So what passes for history is imagined, and it is also a block to the imagining of the things further, that in the name of emancipation or empowerment, they are altogether more relevant and to the point. In other words, what passes for history tends to be a motivated work. Motivated work in the sense, as we saw, the philosophical assumptions of the author or the writer of the history, and what is being presented in history tends to be also presented to us in a manner that we are probably prevented from rethinking the history as it is found in the textbooks or in our own literary work, and also in the name of emancipation and empowerment, history tends to be presented in a particular phenomenon. And when you talk of history, we all know that why people want to know history, because they want to find, not only they want to change for the better, they also want to find out that how they were being treated in the past, and where is the need, and whether there is a need for emancipation from the old historical long-held beliefs as they are in the history, and also how self-empowerment yeah. So here, in the context of this need for empowerment, and also in the context of emancipation, we find that sometimes the presentation of the history at any particular time may be acting as an obstruction for our own knowledge production about our own need for emancipation and need for also empowerment. So here, when you talk about little more, we find that that history tends to be known as historicization of the past. And by historization, we tend to understand that it tends to be a kind of a narrative. It tends to be a kind of a narrative representation of the things that have happened in the past, in particular, of a particular peculiar time-space product of a certain kind of essentiality, which was which is typical of the time within which this historical work of the past is being attempted. In other words, if you talk of the historicization of the past, we primarily understand that it is solely concerned with the Western, European, and North American consciousness of the 19th century, which tends to be filling our own historicization of the past or the history work of the past. So here we find, when we talk of essentially Western, essentially European, or essentially North American consciousness, we tend to see that the kind of Enlightenment ideas of Enlightenment and later the philosophical ideas tend to have made inroads into our own history of the past, not only of India, but also of many other communities who may be residing in the so-called countries of the South. So here, when we history, when you talk of history as the past, it tends to be only one way of past thinking. It tends to be solely concerned with the past and doesn't seem to be at all concerned with the future. And so history has something. When you talk of history as the past, or when you talk of historicization of something, we need to understand that historicization of something does not have histories in it, not in the past, not even now. So here is somewhere that shows the limitations of any historical work when we tend to compare the past with that of the present or that of the future. So that's why we say historicization doesn't have anything to do with that, doesn't have histories of the past, and cannot also be said to have histories in the present as well. So rethinking history, if we agree that it is histories all over the past, then we need to also, as times change, as development changes in the society, as the communities tend to further grow, and as knowledge production tends to take place in various in the life of the communities or in the communities context, we need to understand the rethinking of history tends to become a crucial part of the experiment of the modern. So in the modern times, I think if we understand today, we tend to have come in past into the era of modernity, and in modernity, as we know, that the ancient ideas, ancient history tends to be questioned much more virulently, much more in a scrutinizing manner, and where we tend to understand that rethinking tends to become a kind of a crucial part or crucial responsibility in the context of the so-called thinking individuals who are concerned with presentation of the achievements of the communities of their or other communities at any point of time to the so-called world community, or to the so-called people of the world, who tend to be looking further to learn more and more about various communities as they seem to be existing or living on our own planet. And here we find that besides being a rethinking history, besides being a crucial part of our human endeavor, and it also tends to be an experiment of the modern day era or modernity, and through and why? Because that people realize that by having a different gaze, by looking at the same happening through a different eye, through a different perception, through a different discursive practice, one can probably learn about the future orientation and the needs for liberation and postmodern discourses which may be hidden in the desire of the community. So that's how I think rethinking is primarily an exercise which tends to be solely dedicated towards understanding the experience, towards understanding the desire, the discursive practices, the deconstruction through way of deconstruction, through the future orientation of the community, and also the story of liberation or the desire of liberation of the community through in a postmodernist sense, and also through some kind of a postmodern discourse. So here, when you talk about rethinking history, it tends to say, if we have to understand as to how the rethinking is important in our own country, I think we need to understand, as we were saying before, that the rethinking or the rewriting of history has become very, very important, simply because that there with the change in the power structure, with the change in the changes in the political parties occupying the seats of power in their own country, they seem to have derisive ideas about the history of India as has been presented in our own history book and also to our own community. And as they seem to be wedded to a particular ideology, they seem to be advocating a particular way that people need to rethink history, and hence they have to rewrite history so as to represent the same phenomenon as they have been described by other, as we call it, left-wing left-wing authors of history, in a typical manner, where the present-day political party tends to have a kind of an idea where the history needs to be presented to our own communities in a different manner than what it has been today. So rethinking history in India has not only been limited to 1994 with the BJP in power, but if you see in the post-colonial history of India, in the post-independent history of India, that history has also not remained constant. It has taken different meaning in different form at different time and also in different situation right from 1947 till today. So whether when you talk of rethinking history or rewriting history, tends to be almost, we can treat it as a kind of a continuous exercise as our rational minds, because rational minds tend to have attempted to, and although there is a fashion of labeling people who tend to think differently than us in a very narrow manner, but that seems to be very dangerous, because the moment we tend to describe our enemies in a very highly negative manner, it tends to take us away from facts and tend to push us into the realm of what we call it again, imagination based on hallucination. Because if we call our enemies very, very bad or biased, if we call others biased, we are also leaving us open to be labeled as biased as well, because when we call others biased, we cannot be regarded as free thinking individual. But nonetheless, and here we find that the rewriting history or rethinking history has been advocated by most probably and most importantly by the group, right-wing groups, as they happen to be present in today's India, and that seem to have also forced ICHR, Indian Council of Historical Research, to stop the other left-wing histories which have been written in the context of Towards Freedom, which is a big project undertaken by the ICHR. It has also forced NCRT to delete certain references to certain historical happenings, which is not to the liking of the right-wing group, and which they think tends to be denigrating our own nation, and tends to have taken the writing of history or rethinking of history into a different direction. So here we find that in the context of post-colonial India, we find the historiography, the art of writing history, has also undergone changes. And how the changes? If we tend, and we talk of rethinking history, history tends to be comprising of various sources, and tends to be also comprising of various approaches which have been adopted in the context of history writing. But when you see historiography in the days of post-independent India, we find that history tends to be the India's independent history writing tends to be a project of colonial history, because after the colonialists left India, and when in India's history tend to have been attempted to be written by the so-called historian, we find that it tends to be largely motivated by the so-called colonial values and idioms which were dominating our own Indian society at that point of time. But if you go back to the pre-colonial India, before the British came, we find that in the pre-colonial India's history, we find that the Orientalists, comprising of W. William Jones and also H.T. Selbrock, they tend to have glorified the ancient India in a manner that the India's law, India's institution, India's governance practices, India's social situation were considered to be at a very high level, and the whole ancient India is considered to be a golden period in the history of India and in the history of India's communities. So here the Orientalist ideas had dominated history writing in the past, in the pre-colonial India. But as soon as the early 19th century ideas of freedom and individualism came on to dominate our own human consciousness, we find that the Orientalist glorification of India's past was abandoned, and it was looked at from a very, very different perspective, which was propagated by the so-called liberal historians. And here we find the liberal history tend to have become more liberal history writers tend to idealize the modern West, the modern Western ideas comprising of individualism, freedom, and also democracy, and tend to have presented India's history in a very, very different manner, which is in opposition to that of the so-called Orientalist. And here we find that when James Mill was writing history on Macaulay, we are famous of the Macaulay's Dispatch. We find that they seem to have presented India's history in the 19th century as something which is very, very dark. And they felt that India, and since India's development was compared with the development of the modern West, India's development or India was presented in a very, very dark manner, and India came to be known as a dark continent where there was absence of any kind of a knowledge, absence of any kind of modern ideas, and hence Indian people were presented as savages. And that is where I find, and then we find that in the West, the Western world, the Western Europe had moved from Enlightenment right up to modernity, and since that process was not present in India, India was presented to be a dark continent, or to be living in the era of darkness. But we find that as we go to late 19th century, with the growth of capitalism, which acquired the highest form of imperialism, as more and more the imperialist ideas tend to have made inroad into our own society through the British colonialists and through the inroad of capitalism into India's economy and India's society, we find that the imperial representation tend to have undergone changes. And there we find that the British capitalism tend to have met with India's resistance by the army, by the Indian sepoys, and by which is known as the Sepoy Revolution of 1857. We also talk of various peasants' rebellion, which were very, very frequent in India's history during the colonial days. This kind of rise of Indian mutiny, rise of peasant struggles, tend to have also influenced the imperial presentation of the India's history, and that tend to have made the so-called liberal history writers to abandon the idea of savaging the Indian people, and also made them to abandon their own mission, which they used to call it under quote civilization mission. So here we find that liberalism with the rise of with the local resistance of army and with local resistance, or call it mutiny of army and peasant struggles, we find the liberalism lost its enthusiasm and also abandoned the mission of civilizing the Indians, whom they used to call savages in the past. So here, when you talk of this history writing in the late 19th century, we find that the history was totally centered around any kind of impossibility of change in the East. So that is where we find that the so-called liberal thinkers did not continue with their idea of seeing progress in the East, and they seem to present in India as if it was a land of impossibility of any kind of change, which the so-called agents of modern West were looking forward to in our own country. And here we find also structured by the racial, climatic, and evolutionary theories, historical explanation of India in the late 19th century primarily focused on the inferiority of Indians, problem of disease landscape, and also the lack of any kind of a change that is going to come about in our own country. So here we find that the history writing tend to have focused on the inferiority of the native people, of the Indians, problem of and the disease landscape. They did not like the landscape where they saw that the so-called modernity projects could not be successful, and hence they tend to have also when they were not willing to have any hope for change, to see any change in our own in India, in our own country, they seem to have also presented the picture of our Indian native population as lazy Indians. We all understand, no matter we may be speaking English language, we also need to remember that the way the history has been presented to us tend to be very, very derogatory, very, very denigrating to any kind of a human community where nobody could at all very surely say that there would be no change to come about in the present or in the future history of the so-called community. But they tend to have presented us in a very, very not only when you use the word savages, when you use the word civilization mission, and when you use the word as we call it, that lazy natives or lazy Indians, we must know that the history certainly did have a kind of a motivation, a kind of a intention, where there was a kind of a very, very strict and well-organized agenda of showing people in a negative manner, which will not only harm their self-confidence, which will also probably deny them any hope of any change that may come about in the future with regard to any particular community or with regard to particular country. So here we find that the native theories which were presented, and we find that as India became independent, we found that there was a rise of nationalist histories, where nationalist histories tend to have emerged in opposition to what we know or what we can call imperial and the communal histories which were being written about during the colonial times. So, the rise of nationalism became the hallmark of the Indians, not only during the freedom struggle, it also seems to have permeated into the various other exercises, including writing of history in the so-called post-colonial country after India became independent. And here we find, even though we find the nationalist history as it became an exercise, it critiqued the colonial ideas, yet it is seen that the nationalist ideas also tend to have used certain categories which were highly colonial in nature, which are not only being used by the colonial people in the past, which also tend to have the same Western meaning, the same Western values, and also the same Western idioms, which were totally alien to our own nation or to our own society. So because the so-called nationalist historians tend to accept certain categories which were shaped and influenced by the imperial representation of Indian society, we find the nationalist history can be said to have some colonial orientation rather than free from any kind of a colonial orientation which was totally derogatory, which was totally denigrating, which was against the so-called India's, against the Indians and also against the India's story. And here we find, so the nationalists tend to, and we also find at certain times, nationalists tend to have returned to ancient past, where they tend to have also, in the context of the history writing of the past, tend to have glorified certain communal assumptions, and also tend to have glorified the ancient golden period, which they call it ancient golden period, which is now, we find that people seem to be probably saying that we had this kind of thing in the past, which is not happening. But it seems to be a glorification. It seems to be devoid of any kind of a logical interpretation, simply because that as historians, some historians seem to have bent upon glorification of the past, of the ancient history, of the ancient idea. And here we find that the nationalists also tend to have, some nationalists also tend to have written history with some kind of a, as you call it, communal assumptions. So here we find the nationalist history writing tends to be also not very not pursued or progressed in a right manner, simply because that somewhere the ancient ideas have been glorified, which cannot be verified now, verified as it happened in the past. And also some nationalist historians also tend to have adopted communal assumption in the context of our own history writing or writing of India's history of the past, present, and also of the near past. And here we find, and we see that while communalists tend to have seen nationalism as articulation of community's interest, we find that the nationalists tend to have subordinated the idea of self to that of nation or to that of individual rights. So the communalists who are writing their own history tend to have regarded the ideas of the community to be much more supreme, while the nationalist historians who were not writing the communal history tend to have subordinated the idea of any self of a person, the idea of a person, to the idea of a nation, and also to the idea, as you call it, to the idea of individual rights, because they were imbued with the idea of individualism, which had come up in the context of the Western society. So here, when we talk about this, we need to understand that the communal histories tend to have filled the past with intercommunity conflicts, and the nationalists tend to have seen history as as an era of amity and as an era of immunity, as an era of amity and as an era of unity. So here we find that even in the context of the post-independent history writing, we find there is a kind of a different perception, which you call it some kind of a duality, where you see that that people tend to glorify, people tend to focus on the phenomena that they tend to consider important in defense of their own imagination, in defense of their self-construction, rather than look at the facts as they should be looked at in the era of scientificism, or in the scientific era. So here we find that that some sections of the history tend to have also, tends to be used also religious categories in the narration of the happenings of the past. Hello. So here, anything which is there? Anything, sir? Anything?
Sir, by mistake, I think.
No problem, no problem. No, I was just trying to, no problem. So here we find that when you talk of the historians, we find that even today, while historians tend to be glorifying the past, tends to be also presenting the history as the history of conflicts, and some historians tend to present the historical happenings as that of unity and amity, and some also tend to look at historical happenings of the past through some kind of a use of communal lens. And in the post-independent India, we can also see there has been also an emergence of a what you call it secular left-wing historians who tend to have looked at history in a much more different manner than which is sharply different from that of the other historians that we seem to have talked about before. And here, when we talk of when you look at the nationhood, the concept of nationhood tends to undergo changes at different point of time with different historians, and with different nationhood, we find that the post-colonial idea of nationhood tends to have also undergone serious changes in the case of our own history. And here we find that the nation's meaning tends to have also, the meaning of nation also tends to undergo changes, also more particularly with the rise of subaltern history. When you talk about the rise of the subaltern, we need to understand that history tends to be rather confined to the majority sections of the society, and where the so-called minority, the Adivasis, the Dalits, and the women who are not being talked about or written about in the context of own history, where their contributions were not being pointed out as frequently or as strongly as it was the case with other ideas and also with other communities. So here we find, when you talk of the changes to come of history, and we find that there have been over the period, there have been different attempts at writing history at different point of time, and which tends to point out to the fact that probably that there is a kind of a fractured understanding, and that is being given to historical events and presented to us, which tends to call for a kind of a holistic understanding of our own history. If a particular nation or a particular community or a particular country has to be understood, has to be studied in a proper context. I think, when you talk of rewriting history, and in that context, we find that the rewriting or the rethinking history tends to be of great importance, great significance to us as a researcher. Then the question comes that how we need to rethink, and why we need to rethink, and why and which way we need to proceed so as to be free from the kind of negative ways and means which have been followed in the writing history, and to be able to present the history of the community in a much more balanced, and also in a much more free from any kind of biased manner, in a fair manner, as we call it. But here, that way, we need to, as researchers, there is enormous importance for us to have some kind of an integrated approach towards history writing. In other words, to be free from to be fair, we need to have a kind of an integrated approach where we need to see and balance our own narration as they have happened in the past, without either glorifying or rather demonizing the communities which has been seen in the context of India's history writing right from the ancient days up to today. And I think that is where, when you talk of this, not only when you talk of the India's history, we can also see that India has always presented a history of divisions. If you talk of the North and South, I think this idea started from the Aryan days, where the Dravidians who were settled down in the south because of the color, because they had color of the skin as dark, they were considered to be inferior to the so-called white population during the Aryan civilization. One doesn't, and that is where we can see the racism which came up in the long past tend to have also become a kind of a what do you call it, kind of a signage in our own discourse and also in our own everyday talking. And that is where and then when from the Aryan days as you come today, we'll see that the same kind of racism, or we call it the caste history that has been talked about and written about in India's history, tend to be presenting a divisive picture and tend to be presented in a manner that one doesn't know actually whether caste system that is being practiced in India or practiced in the past was really a caste system, or it was different from what it is being presented by the so-called liberal left-wing intellectuals who are known as history writers. Because I do not deny that there has been no caste system, but then we should also remember the caste system was primarily an occupational category, and then that was there to that was attempted for an ordering of the society, where probably as we see that the what is known as that the modern day phenomenon which is present in the capitalism is the this one word I'll tell you later, that the reordering of the society, and probably to make people work as much as is needed for the society, and also which gave rise to the so-called emergence of capitalism preceded by feudalism in our own society. What you call it, I think if you remember about Rousseau, the hallmark of capitalism is, as we call it, division of labor. Yeah, the division of labor tends to be responsible for the creation of classes in any society, and that is where we find that this caste system, although it was primarily a kind of a occupational division which could be akin to the class divisions as we find in the modern day capitalist framework, however, it was presented in a kind of a manner as if it was typical to India's Hindu society, and it was not present elsewhere. But when you look into the communities, we find that the same kind of social divisions, if we agree, caste is a social division, other than being an occupational division, tends to present in all kind of religious communities. And so that is where since the history is being presented in a typical manner, in a biased manner, or which is not free and free and fair, and also not respectful of the communities who are present. When we talk of respectful, we are not meaning that nobody should talk of the negative things which are present in our own community. But nonetheless, when there is so much of a challenge in the context of unfairness, in the context of not so balanced presentation of the history of the community or history of the country, and also when the whole community or communities are being branded as majority or communal vis-a-vis the other communities, there is a tremendous responsibility and also tremendous agreement amongst the people that there is a need for rethinking of the history, where probably the various social categories that we use, whether it's in terms of ethnicity, in terms of gender, in terms of various other social categories, need to be re-looked at so as to be able to present a picture of the community or communities, if you talk of India, in a manner that is in keeping with the modern day requirements of knowledge, purely within quote knowledge, rather than any kind of negative information which tends to go against the so-called dictate of modern day scientific knowledge. I think I will end it here. I don't know, it's finished very early, but I will end it here. We can talk about it. And if there is any idea, you have some ideas to share, we'll be also happy to learn and see how things can happen. Thank you. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Thank you, sir, for delivering your lecture. So, meanwhile, if participants have any questions to ask or anything to discuss with sir, please come ahead. And I would request Migma Ongdup, are you here?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay, great. So till the time participants frame their questions or want to ask anything to sir, till then I would request Migma Ongdup to summarize and conclude sir's lecture.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you. Thank you, sir, for such a wonderful deliberation. And actually, I was supposed to summarize yesterday lecture, but unfortunately, I could not do the same because of. So today, before summarizing the lecture, I would like to say something. First of all, I would like to thank Bodoland University and all the resource person, especially English department, Bodoland University, for organizing this kind of workshop during this pandemic. So regarding summarization, I would like to focus some important points delivered in sir lecture. As this lecture is about rewriting history, rejudging over